I remember the weight of that apple in my hand, how it caught the autumn light like a small sun, and how I never imagined that such a simple thing could change the entire course of my existence. They say that kindness is its own reward, but I have learned that sometimes kindness is also a key that unlocks doors we never knew existed, doors that lead to worlds we never dared to dream of entering. My name is Vivian Caldwell, and I was born in the shadow of great estates, in a small cottage at the edge of an orchard that my mother tended with the same devotion she gave to her prayers. We were not wealthy, not by any measure that the world would recognize, but we were rich in the quiet ways that mattered most. My mother taught me to read by candlelight, her voice soft and patient as she guided my fingers across the pages of worn books she had somehow acquired. She taught me to find poetry in the changing of seasons, to see beauty in the morning frost that silvered the grass, and in the evening light that turned the apple blossoms to gold. And she taught me, above all else, that dignity was something no one could take from you unless you surrendered it yourself. Our cottage was small, but filled with warmth. The walls were whitewashed and decorated with dried flowers that my mother gathered from the meadows. The hearth was always lit in winter, and the smell of baking bread mingled with the scent of lavender that she tucked into every corner. We had a garden where we grew vegetables, and beyond it, the orchard stretched in neat rows, the apple trees standing like sentinels, guarding our little kingdom of peace. My mother never spoke of my father. When I asked, as children do, she would simply smile and say that some stories are best left untold, that what mattered was not where I came from, but who I chose to become. I learned, over time, to stop asking, though the question never entirely left me. There was a sadness in her eyes sometimes, a faraway look that suggested memories she could not or would not share. I wonder now if she carried secrets that would have changed everything I thought I knew about myself and my place in the world. She died when I was 18. Taken by a fever that swept through the village like a thief in the night, stealing lives with cold indifference. I sat beside her bed for 3 days, holding her hand, watching her slip further and further away from me. In her final hours, she was lucid enough to speak, and her words have stayed with me ever since. "Vivienne," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "you have a light in you that the world will try to extinguish. Do not let them. Do not let the cruelty of others make you cruel. Do not let the coldness of the world freeze your heart. Promise me that you will always choose kindness, even when it costs you, even when it seems foolish. Promise me." I promised, though I did not fully understand what I was promising. I was young and grief-stricken, and the world seemed very dark in that moment. But I kept that promise, held it close to my heart like a talisman, and in the years that followed, it became the compass by which I navigated my life. I buried her beneath the largest apple tree in our orchard, the one she had planted on the day of my birth. I placed wildflowers on her grave and said prayers I was not sure anyone was listening to. And then I stood alone in the cottage that had once been filled with her presence and faced the stark reality of my situation. The cottage and the orchard did not belong to us. They were part of the Blackwood estate, and without my mother's labor to justify our tenancy, I had no claim to them. Lord Marcus Blackwood was not known for his generosity, and I knew that it would only be a matter of time before I was turned out. I had no money, no family, no prospects. I was 18 years old, alone in the world, and the future stretched before me like an endless gray sea. I sought employment at Thornfield Manor, the great house that dominated the landscape like a stone giant. It was a cold and imposing structure, all gray stone and narrow windows that seemed to watch you with disapproval. The walls were thick and ancient, and the corridors echoed with footsteps and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. There were servants who claimed the manor was haunted, that the ghosts of former inhabitants walked the halls at night, but I never saw anything that could not be explained by shadows and imagination. The true ghosts of Thornfield were not supernatural. They were the ghosts of cruelty and indifference that lived in the hearts of its masters. The Blackwood family had owned these lands for generations, their wealth built on the labor of others and the strategic marriages that had merged their fortunes with those of other great houses. Lord Marcus Blackwood was the current patriarch, a man of rigid posture and even more rigid principles. He was tall and thin, with a face that seemed carved from the same gray stone as his manner, and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. He believed that those beneath his station existed solely for his convenience, that their feelings and aspirations were of no more consequence than the feelings of the furniture. His wife, Lady Honoria, was a thin woman with sharp features and a voice that could cut glass. She had been beautiful once, or so the older servants said, but years of living with Lord Marcus had leached the softness from her face and left behind only brittleness and spite. She found fault in everything, criticized every servant for imagined shortcomings, and seemed to derive pleasure only from the suffering of others. They had no children, which the servants whispered was perhaps a mercy, for what child could thrive under such a roof, in such an atmosphere of coldness and control? I was assigned to work in the kitchens, scrubbing pots and peeling vegetables under the watchful eye of Mrs. Brennan, the cook. She was a stout woman with red cheeks and hands roughened by years of labor, but there was kindness in her eyes, and she took pity on me in those early days when I was still raw with grief and struggling to learn the ways of the household. She taught me which tasks to prioritize, which servants to avoid, and which corridors Lord Marcus frequented so that I could make myself scarce when he passed. She also taught me to keep my head down and my opinions to myself, lessons that would prove invaluable in the years to come. After several months, when my competence had been noted and my reliability established, I was permitted to help in the gardens and the orchards. This was as close as I came to joy in those years, for the trees reminded me of my mother, and the earth beneath my fingernails felt like a connection to the life I had lost. I would rise before dawn and walk through the mist-shrouded grounds, breathing in the scent of damp soil and growing things, and for a few precious moments I could almost believe that I was home again, that my mother was waiting for me in the cottage with a cup of tea and a warm smile. The orchard at Thornfield was larger than ours had been, with dozens of apple trees arranged in perfect rows. There were other fruits too, pears and plums and cherries, but it was the apples I loved best. I tended them with care that went beyond duty, pruning and watering and talking to them softly, as my mother had taught me. The head gardener, an elderly man named Mr. Hollister, noticed my dedication and allowed me more responsibility than was typical for a kitchen maid. It was a small kindness, but in that household, small kindnesses were rare enough to be treasured. 3 years passed in this manner, each day indistinguishable from the last, a gray procession of duties and silences. I learned to make myself invisible, which is the greatest skill a servant can possess. I moved through the manor like a shadow, anticipating needs before they were expressed, completing tasks without being asked, never drawing attention to myself. I had accepted that this would be my life, that I would grow old in service, that the dreams I had once harbored of love and belonging were foolish fantasies best forgotten. I was 21 years old, and I felt ancient, as though the weight of my circumstances had aged me far beyond my years. It was October when everything changed. The leaves had turned to gold and crimson, painting the landscape in colors that seemed almost too vivid to be real. The air carried the sharp sweetness of apples ready for harvest, mingled with the earthier scents of decaying leaves and wood smoke. Autumn had always been my favorite season, the time when the world seemed to pause between the abundance of summer and the austerity of winter, a liminal space where anything felt possible. Lord Blackwood had been hosting visitors for the past fortnight, men of influence and power whose carriages filled the drive and whose voices echoed through the halls late into the night. There was something different about these gatherings, a tension that permeated the household like a low, constant hum. The servants were instructed to be even more invisible than usual, to avoid the guest quarters entirely, to speak to no one about what they might overhear. There was talk, whispered in the kitchen when Mrs. Brennan was not listening, of political matters, of alliances being forged, and secrets being traded. But I paid little attention. The affairs of the aristocracy were as distant to me as the stars, beautiful perhaps to observe, but utterly beyond my reach. That morning I had been sent to collect apples from the far orchard, the one that bordered the estate of Lord Ravenswood, the Earl whose lands adjoined the Blackwood property. The two families had been allies for generations. Their fortunes intertwined in ways that I did not fully understand. What I did know was that Lord Ravenswood was a man feared by the servants who attended his estate. His temper was legendary. His treatment of those beneath him was said to be cruel beyond measure, and there were rumors, never confirmed but never quite dispelled, of servants who had simply disappeared, their fates unknown and uninvestigated. I walked the familiar path through the woods, my basket tucked under my arm, my thoughts drifting as they often did to memories of my mother. The morning mist clung to the ground like a living thing, curling around the trunks of trees and softening the edges of the world. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my feet and the distant call of crows circling overhead. The world felt hushed, expectant, as though nature itself was holding its breath. I did not know then that fate was arranging itself around me, that the threads of my destiny were being woven into a pattern I could never have imagined. The old stone building appeared through the trees, half hidden by ivy and the neglect of years. I had passed it many times before and had been told by Mr. Hollister that it was an abandoned storehouse, a relic from an earlier age when the Ravenswood estate had been larger and more prosperous. The walls were crumbling, the roof was partially collapsed, and the windows were nothing but dark hollows that stared out at the forest like empty eyes. No one had used it for anything in decades, or so I had been told. But on this morning, something made me pause. A sound, so faint that at first I thought I had imagined it, drifted through the chill air. It was a metallic sound, a clinking that seemed out of place in the natural silence of the woods. I stopped walking and listened, my heart beginning to beat faster, though I did not yet understand why. The sound came again, and this time I recognized it for what it was. It was the sound of chains. I should have continued on my way. Every instinct born of my years in service told me to mind my own affairs, to complete my task and return to the manor without incident. I had learned through hard experience that curiosity was dangerous, that those who asked questions or investigated matters that did not concern them often found themselves dismissed without references or worse. The safe path was clear. The safe path was to walk away. But something held me there, some whisper of my mother's voice in my heart, reminding me that we are not truly alive if we turn away from the suffering of others. I set down my basket at the base of a tree and approached the building, my steps slow and cautious, my heart beating so loudly that I was certain it could be heard across the county. The door was heavy and old, made of oak that had weathered centuries of storms and neglect. It was not locked, but it resisted my push, the hinges groaning in protest as though warning me to turn back. I ignored the warning and pushed harder, and the door swung open with a sound like a sigh, revealing the darkness within. The smell was what struck me first. It was a rank mixture of dampness, unwashed flesh, and something I would later recognize as despair. It was the smell of suffering, of hopelessness, of a human being reduced to circumstances no person should ever have to endure. I covered my nose with my sleeve and stepped forward, my eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. The interior of the building was larger than I had expected, a single open space that had perhaps once been used to store grain or equipment. The walls were stone, slick with moisture and green with moss. The floor was packed earth, uneven and littered with debris. And in the far corner, illuminated by thin shafts of light that filtered through cracks in the ancient walls, I saw him. He was chained to the wall like an animal, iron manacles around his wrists connected to heavy chains that were bolted into the stone. His clothes, which had once been fine, were now torn and filthy, stained with dirt and what might have been blood. His hair hung in matted tangles around a face that was gaunt with hunger, the cheekbones standing out sharply, the eyes sunken in their sockets. He had not been shaved in weeks, and a dark beard obscured the lower half of his face. He looked like a man who had been to hell and was still there, trapped in a purgatory of suffering from which there was no escape. But it was his eyes that arrested me, that made me forget my fear and my caution. They were gray, the color of storm clouds over the sea, and they held not the wild desperation I had expected, but rather a strange calm, a dignity that no amount of suffering had been able to extinguish. He looked at me with those eyes, looked into me, and I felt as though he could see everything I was, everything I had been, everything I might become. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other. The silence stretched between us, filled with questions neither of us could ask, with a connection neither of us could explain. I did not know what to say, how to acknowledge the horror of what I was witnessing. He was clearly a prisoner, kept here in secret, and my mind reeled with the implications. This was Ravenswood land, but the building was so close to the Blackwood border that I wondered if the two families were somehow complicit in whatever crime was being committed here. He spoke first, his voice rough from disuse, but still carrying the unmistakable cadence of education and breeding. It was the voice of a man who had been raised in privilege, who had been taught to speak with authority and precision, though now that voice was weakened by thirst and exhaustion. "Do not be afraid," he said. "I mean you no harm." I almost laughed at the absurdity of his words. He was the one in chains, broken and starving, and yet he was reassuring me. But there was something in his tone that demanded to be taken seriously, an authority that transcended his circumstances, a nobility that no amount of degradation could diminish. I found my voice, though it trembled when I spoke. "Who are you? What has been done to you?" He shook his head slowly, the movement seeming to cost him great effort. "My name no longer matters," he said. "What matters is that you should not be here. If they find you, if they discover that you have seen me, they will not let you leave. You must go. Please, for your own sake, go now and forget that you ever saw this place." But I could not go. I could not walk away from this man, this stranger whose suffering had somehow become my responsibility. I looked at him, at his hollow cheeks and trembling hands, and I thought of my mother's voice, of the promise I had made to her as she lay dying. I thought of kindness, of the choice to help even when helping was dangerous, even when the safe path was to turn away. And I thought of the basket I had left outside, filled with apples fresh from the harvest. I told him to wait, which was perhaps unnecessary given his circumstances, and I went back to retrieve the basket. When I returned, I saw that his eyes had followed me, that he was watching me with an expression I could not quite read. Hope, perhaps, or disbelief, or some mixture of the two. I crossed the room and knelt beside him, close enough to see the lines of pain etched into his face, the way his hands trembled against the cold stone floor. The chains clinked softly as he shifted, and I saw that his wrists were raw and bloody from where the manacles had chafed his skin. How long had he been here? How long had he been suffering in this forgotten place, with no one to help him, no one to even know he existed? I reached into my basket and withdrew an apple, a perfect specimen with skin the color of sunset. I had intended to bring this one back to the kitchen, for it was the finest I had found, the kind of apple that Mrs. Brennan would use for the Lord's table. But now it seemed to have a different purpose, a destiny that had been waiting for it all along. I held it out to him. He looked at the apple, then at me, and something shifted in his expression. It was as though a wall crumbled inside him, as though my small gesture had breached a fortress that cruelty and deprivation had failed to penetrate. His gray eyes glistened, and I realized with a start that he was fighting back tears. He reached out with trembling fingers and took the fruit from my hand, and as he did, His skin brushed against mine. It was the briefest of contacts, lasting no more than a heartbeat, but I felt it through my entire body, a spark of something I had never before experienced. It was as though that touch had awakened something dormant within me, some capacity for feeling that I had thought long dead. "Thank you," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. I cannot remember the last time someone showed me kindness. I watched as he lifted the apple to his lips and took a bite, his eyes closing in something like ecstasy as he tasted the fruit. He chewed slowly, savoring every morsel, and I felt tears prick at my own eyes. What kind of world was this, where a man could be reduced to such gratitude for a single apple? What kind of monsters had done this to him? I asked him again who he was, what had happened, why he was being held here. But footsteps sounded in the distance, the crunch of boots on fallen leaves, and his expression changed instantly from gratitude to urgent warning. "You must go," he said, his voice low and fierce. "Now, they cannot find you here. Please, if you have any sense of self-preservation, you will leave this place and never return." I hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and an equally powerful instinct to stay, to somehow protect this man I had only just met. But his eyes were burning with an intensity that would not be denied, and I knew that to stay would be to put us both in danger. "I will come back," I whispered. "I will bring more food. I will find a way to help you." He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in those gray depths. It might have been hope. It might have been fear. But when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "You owe me nothing," he said. "You do not know who I am or what I have done. For all you know, I deserve to be here." "No one deserves this," I said, and the conviction in my voice surprised even me. "Whatever you have done, no one deserves to be treated like an animal." The footsteps were growing closer. I gathered my basket and rose to my feet, my heart pounding with fear and something else, something I could not name. "Go," he said again, "and be careful. Trust no one in that house, no one." I fled through the door and into the woods, running without looking back until I was deep enough among the trees that I could no longer hear the footsteps. I stopped, leaning against an oak to catch my breath, my mind racing with everything I had seen and heard. Who was he? Why was he being held prisoner? And who were the people he was warning me about? The pieces of the puzzle refused to fit together, and I was left with more questions than answers. I told no one what I had seen. The words of warning echoed in my mind, "Trust no one," and I heeded them even though I did not fully understand their meaning. I was afraid, yes, but more than that, I sensed that revealing the prisoner's existence would somehow put him in greater danger. The Blackwoods were powerful, and if they were involved in his captivity, then any word from a lowly servant would be dismissed at best and punished at worst. So I kept my silence and went about my duties, but my mind was never far from that cold stone room and the man with the storm-gray eyes. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my narrow bed in the servants' quarters, a small room I shared with two other maids who snored softly in their beds, and I stared at the ceiling with wide eyes. The image of the prisoner haunted me, his face gaunt and weary, but still somehow proud, his voice refined and gentle despite his circumstances. His eyes, those gray depths that had seemed to see past my servant's dress and into something I did not know I possessed. I had felt something when I was with him, something I had never felt before. It was not quite attraction, though there was that too, buried beneath the horror and the pity. It was more like recognition, as though I had been waiting all my life to meet him, as though our encounter had been written in the stars long before either of us was born. I knew this was foolish, the romantic fancy of a lonely young woman, but I could not shake the feeling that my life had changed irrevocably in that crumbling stone building. I rose before dawn, driven by an impulse I did not examine too closely. The other maids were still sleeping, and I crept out of the room with exaggerated care, avoiding the floorboards I knew would creak. I made my way down to the kitchens, which were already stirring with activity as Mrs. Brennan and her staff prepared for the day ahead. I had to be careful. I could not simply take food without it being noticed. But I knew the rhythms of the kitchen, knew which supplies were carefully counted and which were more loosely monitored. A heel of bread that would be given to the pigs, a wedge of cheese that had begun to harden and would be discarded, a flask of water from the pump in the courtyard. Small things, insignificant things, but things that might make the difference between life and death for a man who had been starving in the darkness. I hid these provisions beneath my cloak and made my way back to the orchard, my heart hammering with every step. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the world seemed impossibly beautiful and impossibly cruel all at once. How could such beauty exist in a world where men were chained in forgotten buildings and left to die? The stone building looked even more desolate in the morning light, its crumbling walls a testament to neglect and decay. I approached cautiously, listening for any sounds of movement, any indication that the captors had returned. But the woods were silent except for the bird song and the rustle of leaves, and I slipped through the door with my heart in my throat. He was still there. The chains had not been moved, and neither had he, but there was a new alertness in his posture when I entered, as though he had been waiting for me, as though he had known I would return even when I had promised myself that I would not. When he saw my face, something like relief softened his features. The tension in his shoulders eased, and for a moment he looked almost young, almost whole, despite the ravages of his captivity. "You came back," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. "I told you to forget me." I knelt beside him and unwrapped the food I had brought. "Forgetting," I said, "is not one of my talents, and I have decided that you will have to accept my help whether you wish to or not." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, the first I had seen, and it transformed him utterly. Beneath the grime and the exhaustion, beneath the beard and the hollow cheeks, I glimpsed the man he must have been, the man he still was beneath the surface. He was handsome, I realized, handsome in a way that had nothing to do with conventional beauty and everything to do with the strength of his spirit. There was something in his face that spoke of intelligence and compassion, of a soul that had not been broken despite everything that had been done to break it. He ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were a feast fit for royalty. I watched him without speaking, giving him the dignity of silence. When he had finished, he looked at me with those penetrating gray eyes and asked me my name. "Vivian," I said. "Vivian Caldwell." He repeated it softly, as though testing its weight on his tongue, as though committing it to a memory he intended to keep forever. "It is a beautiful name," he said. "It suits you." I felt heat rise to my cheeks and looked away, unused to compliments, uncertain how to receive them. When I asked again for his name, he was silent for a long moment, seeming to weigh some internal decision. I could see the conflict playing across his face, the desire to trust warring with the fear of what that trust might cost. Then he spoke, and his words changed everything. "My name is Nathaniel Thorne," he said. "I am the Duke of Hartwell." I stared at him, certain that I had misheard, or that he was delirious from hunger and thirst. The Duke of Hartwell was one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, a figure of legend whose wealth and influence were spoken of even in the servants' halls of a minor estate like Thornfield. He was said to be young and unmarried, the heir to a vast fortune that included lands and holdings spread across 3 counties. And according to some whispers, he was the strongest candidate for succession to the throne should the aging king fail to produce another heir, his bloodline making him next in the line of succession after the monarch himself. Such a man could not be here, chained in a forgotten building on the border of 2 estates, reduced to gratitude for an apple and a heel of bread. It was impossible. It was absurd. It was the kind of story that belonged in the penny novels that some of the servants read in secret, not in the cold reality of my mundane existence. But his eyes held mine without wavering, and I saw no madness in them, no deception. I saw only truth, as clear and undeniable as the gray of his irises, and I saw something else, something that looked almost like hope. "I see that you do not believe me," he said, and there was no accusation in his tone, only understanding. "I would not believe me either, in your position. But I speak the truth, Vivian Caldwell. I am Nathaniel Thorne, and I have been held here against my will for what I believe to be a fortnight, though time has lost all meaning in this place." He told me his story in fragments, pausing often to gather his strength or to listen for sounds of approaching danger. He had been traveling through the county on matters of state, he said, visiting allies and assessing the political situation in this part of the kingdom. His carriage had been ambushed on a remote stretch of road, attacked by men whose faces were hidden behind masks and whose movements spoke of military training. His guards had been killed, he said, his voice heavy with grief and guilt, and he had been drugged with something that had rendered him insensible. When he awoke, he was in chains, and he had been here ever since. His captors were careful never to show their faces or speak their names in his presence, but he had recognized voices. Lord Ravenswood was certainly involved, he said, his jaw tightening with anger. He was present when I was first brought here. He spoke to someone else, someone whose voice I also recognized, though it took me several days to place it. Lord Blackwood. They are allies in this, working together toward some end I do not fully understand. A conspiracy, I breathed, the word tasting strange on my tongue. Against you? Against the crown, he said, against the succession itself. There are those who do not wish to see me take the throne, should it come to that. There are those who believe that my views on governance, my desire for reform, my sympathy for those who labor in the fields and the factories, make me unfit to rule. They would rather see the kingdom pass to someone more amenable to their interests, someone who will preserve their power and privilege at the expense of everyone else. I listened in horror, my mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what he was describing. These were the men I served, the lords I had believed were merely cold and distant, not actively evil. To learn that they were capable of kidnapping, of treason, of what amounted to slow murder by starvation, was to have my understanding of the world fundamentally shattered. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You do not know me. I could be in their employ, sent to test you. I could be a spy, a trap, a way for them to determine how much you know and whom you might have told." He shook his head slowly, a sad smile touching his lips. "I have been watching you since the moment you entered," he said. "I have had nothing but time to learn to read the faces of men, to see their souls through their eyes. And what I see in you is not deception. What I see in you is something I had begun to believe no longer existed in this world. I see kindness, Vivian. I see compassion. I see a heart that cannot walk past suffering without trying to ease it. You are not capable of the kind of deception they practice. Your heart is too honest for that." His words pierced me in a way I had not expected, reaching into some hidden place where I had stored away all my longing for connection, for recognition, for being truly seen. I had been invisible for so long, a nameless figure moving through the background of other people's lives. And now this man, this duke, this potential king, was looking at me as though I mattered, as though I was real, as though I was someone worth seeing. I asked him what I could do to help, knowing even as I spoke that I was offering to put my life at risk for a man I had known for less than a day. But something had shifted inside me, some calculus of self-preservation giving way to a fiercer imperative. He had been abandoned by everyone who should have protected him, betrayed by those whose duty it was to uphold the order of the realm. And here I was, a servant girl with nothing to offer but bread and apples and an inexplicable determination to see him free. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the internal struggle playing across his face. I could see that he did not want to involve me, that his instinct was to protect me from the danger that surrounded him like a storm waiting to break. But I could also see that he was desperate, that he had been pushed to the very edge of what a man could endure, and that my offer represented perhaps his only hope of survival. "There is a man," he said at last, his voice low and urgent, "a man I trust above all others who will be searching for me. His name is Edmund Holloway, and he serves as my secretary and closest advisor. He is also my friend, the only true friend I have ever had. If you could find a way to send word to him, to let him know where I am being held, he would bring help. He would move heaven and earth to find me." I asked how I might reach this Edmund Holloway, and he told me that the man would likely be in the capital, coordinating the search. My heart sank at the impossibility of the task. The capital was 3 days' journey by carriage, and I had no carriage, no money, no means of traveling such a distance. I was a servant, bound by contract and circumstance to the Blackwood estate, and my absence would be noticed within hours. How could I possibly send a message to a man I had never met, in a city I had never visited, about a conspiracy that involved the very people who controlled my life? But even as I catalogued the obstacles, my mind was working to overcome them. I remembered that the Blackwoods were expecting a delivery from the capital within the week, a shipment of goods that would be brought by a merchant caravan. Perhaps I could find a way to send a message with the returning wagons, or perhaps I could slip away in the confusion of the delivery and find my way to the capital myself. I told the Duke that I would find a way. I did not know how, but I would find a way. He reached out and took my hand in his grip weak but warm, and he thanked me with a sincerity that made my throat tighten with emotion. "You are braver than you know, Vivian Caldwell," he said, "and kinder than this world deserves. Whatever happens, whatever comes of this, I want you to know that you have given me something I thought I had lost forever. You have given me hope." I promised him that I would return the next morning with more food, and I warned him to preserve his strength, for he would need it when freedom came. As I slipped back through the woods toward the manor, my mind was a whirlwind of plans and fears. I was acutely aware that I had crossed a line from which there was no return. I was now complicit in the affairs of dukes and earls, entangled in a conspiracy that could cost me not only my position, but my very life. And yet I felt more alive than I had in years, more certain of my purpose, more connected to something larger than the endless cycle of work and sleep that had defined my existence. It was as though I had been sleepwalking through my life, and Nathaniel Thorne had awakened me to a world of possibility I had never dared to imagine. The next few days passed in a blur of secret missions and carefully concealed anxiety. Each morning, I found an excuse to visit the orchard, and each morning I brought food and water to the Duke. Our conversations in that dim stone room became the center of my existence, the axis around which everything else revolved. We spoke in whispered voices, our words careful and considered, our topics ranging from the practical matters of his escape to deeper subjects, philosophy and literature, and the nature of duty and honor. I discovered that Nathaniel Thorne was a man of formidable intellect and unexpected sensitivity. He had been educated by the finest tutors, had traveled extensively in his youth, had read voraciously on subjects ranging from ancient history to modern science. But he was not pompous or condescending about his knowledge. He shared it freely, delighted when I offered my own perspectives, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions, even when they diverged from his own. He told me about his childhood, which had been lonely despite his privilege. His parents had died when he was young, and he had been raised by guardians who saw him primarily as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be loved. He had learned early that his wealth and position made him a target, that those who professed friendship often had ulterior motives, that trust was a luxury he could rarely afford. "And yet," he said, looking at me with those gray eyes that seemed to see everything, You trusted me with the truth about where I am, and I feel compelled to trust you in return. Perhaps we are both fools. I told him about my own life, about my mother and the orchard, about the dreams I had harbored before circumstance had forced me into service. I spoke of my longing for education, for beauty, for a life that held meaning beyond survival. I confessed things I had never told anyone, secrets of my heart that I had kept locked away for years, and he listened with an attention that made me feel valued, worthy, seen. In the dim light of that cold stone room, with the weight of chains between us, we forged a connection that defied all logic and expectation. I knew that I was falling in love with him, and I knew with equal certainty that such love was impossible. He was a duke, perhaps a future king. I was a servant girl with nothing to offer but my heart and my hands. The chasm between us was wider than any ocean, deeper than any grave. And yet my heart refused to heed the warnings of my mind. It beat for him, sang for him, longed for him with an intensity that frightened me. On the fourth day, the merchant caravan arrived, and I saw my chance. The courtyard was chaos, filled with wagons and horses and men shouting orders. The servants were pressed into service, unloading crates and barrels. And in the confusion, I managed to slip away long enough to speak with one of the drivers. His name was Thomas, a young man with sandy hair and honest eyes who had delivered goods to the manor several times before. He had always treated me with a courtesy that stood out among the rough men of his trade, offering a smile and a polite word when others barely acknowledged my existence. I approached him during a lull in the unloading and asked if I might speak with him privately. We stepped behind one of the wagons, out of sight of the other servants, and I told him that I needed to send a message to the capital. A message of the utmost importance, I said, my voice low and urgent. Life and death importance. Can you help me? He looked at me with curiosity, but did not question my motives. He asked no questions about the contents of the message or why a servant girl would need to contact someone in the capital. He simply nodded and said that he would be returning to the city the following day and that he would carry whatever I needed to send. I thanked him profusely and pressed a letter into his hand. I had written it in the dead of night, using paper and ink that I had taken from Lord Blackwood's study at considerable risk. The study was forbidden to servants, but I had learned long ago how to move through the manor unseen, and I had slipped in through the window while the household slept. I addressed the letter to Edmund Holloway, describing as precisely as I could the location where the Duke was being held. I signed it only with my initials, fearing that my full name might somehow be traced back to me before help could arrive. Thomas tucked the letter into his coat and promised that it would reach its destination. I believed him. There was something in his face that inspired trust, a straightforward honesty that seemed increasingly rare in the world I now inhabited. The caravan departed the next morning, and I watched it go from the window of the servants' quarters, my hands clasped together in silent prayer. I had done all that I could. Now I could only wait and hope that my message would reach Edmund Holloway, that he would believe a letter from an unknown correspondent, and that help would come before the Duke's captors decided to end his life. 2 more days passed, and nothing happened. The manor returned to its normal rhythms. The servants resumed their duties, and the visitors who had been staying with Lord Blackwood departed one by one until the house was quiet again. I continued my secret visits, bringing what comfort I could to Nathaniel, but I could see that he was growing weaker. The cold was deepening as autumn surrendered to the advance of winter, and his body, already ravaged by hunger and mistreatment, was struggling to survive. I brought him blankets stolen from the laundry, extra bread hidden in my pockets, and once, a bottle of brandy that I had taken from Lord Blackwood's own cabinet. He accepted these gifts with gratitude that never diminished, with a tenderness in his eyes that made my heart ache. We talked less now, conserving his strength, but sometimes we simply sat together in silence, my hand in his, drawing comfort from each other's presence. On the 6th day, he told me something that changed the nature of our connection forever. "Vivienne," he said, his voice weaker than it had been. "There is something I must tell you, something that you deserve to know, though it may change how you see me." I told him that nothing could change how I saw him, though I was not entirely sure this was true. I had built an image of him in my mind, a portrait of nobility and suffering, and I was afraid of what might shatter it. "If I die here," he said, and I flinched at the words, wanting to protest, wanting to insist that he would not die, that help was coming, that everything would be well. But he silenced me with a gentle pressure of his fingers on mine. "If I die here," he continued, "I want you to know that you are the only person who has treated me as a human being since I came to this place. Not as a duke, not as an heir, not as a political pawn to be used or discarded. As a man, as Nathaniel. And that matters more to me than any crown, any title, any amount of wealth or power." I felt tears streaming down my cheeks, hot against my cold skin. I told him that he was not going to die, that I would not allow it, that I had not risked everything only to lose him now. He smiled, that sad, beautiful smile that made my heart break and mend all at once. "You have already saved me, Vivienne," he said. "You saved me the moment you walked through that door with an apple in your hand. Whatever happens next, that can never be taken away." On the 7th day, everything changed. I was in the kitchens, helping Mrs. Brennan prepare the midday meal, when the sound of hooves thundered into the courtyard. I ran to the window and saw a sight that made my breath catch in my throat. A dozen soldiers in the royal livery were dismounting before the manor, their faces grim and their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. At their head was a man I would later learn was Edmund Holloway, tall and severe, with gray streaked through his dark hair and eyes that swept the scene with the intensity of a hawk seeking prey. The household erupted in chaos. Servants scattered, uncertain what was happening or what they should do. I heard Lord Blackwood's voice raised in protest, demanding to know the meaning of this intrusion, but his demands were cut short by the cold, clear voice of Edmund Holloway ordering his arrest in the name of the king. I watched from the kitchen window as Lord Blackwood was dragged from his study, his face white with shock and fury. Lady Honoria emerged from the drawing room, her sharp voice raised in a shriek of outrage that was quickly silenced when soldiers took her by the arms. The other servants huddled in corners, their eyes wide with fear, and I stood frozen by the window, scarcely daring to breathe. One of the soldiers detached himself from the group and approached the kitchen entrance. He was young, perhaps not much older than I, with a serious face and kind eyes. He asked if there was a woman named Vivienne Caldwell among the servants. I stepped forward, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "I am Vivienne Caldwell," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and thin. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You are to come with me, miss. There is someone who wishes to see you." I followed him out of the manor and through the familiar woods, along the same path I had walked so many times in the past week. The autumn light was golden, filtering through the remaining leaves, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. My legs trembled with each step, and my mind raced with questions I dared not ask. When we reached the stone building, I saw that the door had been broken open, hanging from a single hinge, and soldiers were moving in and out with purposeful efficiency. Some carried torches to light the dim interior. Others emerged with evidence, chains and manacles and scraps of fabric that I recognized as remnants of Nathaniel's once fine clothing. And then I saw him. Nathaniel was standing in the doorway, supported on either side by soldiers, his chains removed and his face lifted to the pale autumn sun. He was weak and unsteady, barely able to stand without assistance, but he was alive. And when his eyes found mine, across the clearing, a smile broke across his face like dawn breaking over the horizon, like the first light after a long and terrible night. I ran to him without thinking, all considerations of decorum and propriety forgotten in the rush of relief and joy. He opened his arms and caught me. pulling me close despite his weakness, and for a long moment we simply held each other, neither of us speaking, neither of us needing to speak. I could feel his heart beating against my chest, could feel the warmth of his breath in my hair, could feel the solid reality of him, alive and safe and free. "You came back for me," he murmured against my hair. "You saved my life, Vivian Caldwell." I pulled back just enough to look at him, at those gray eyes now bright with unshed tears, at the face I had come to love more than I had ever thought possible. I told him that it was nothing, that anyone would have done the same, that I had only done what my heart demanded. But he shook his head and silenced me with a gentle touch of his finger to my lips. "It was not nothing," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It was everything. You are everything, and I intend to ensure that the world knows exactly what you did and exactly what you mean to me." Edmund Holloway approached us then, his severe face arranged in an expression that might have been respect, though it was difficult to tell. He bowed to Nathaniel, and then, to my astonishment, he bowed to me as well. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice formal but not unkind, "I received your letter. I must confess that I was skeptical at first. A message from an unknown source, claiming to know the whereabouts of His Grace, seemed too good to be true. But there was something in the way you wrote, some sincerity in your words, that convinced me to investigate. And here we are." I did not know what to say. I had never expected to meet this man, let alone receive his thanks. I managed something like a curtsy, awkward and unpracticed, and he offered me a thin smile that was almost warm. "His Grace has spoken of nothing but you since we found him," Edmund Holloway continued. "He insisted that we locate you before anything else, before even returning to the capital. I begin to understand why." The journey to the capital was a blur of exhaustion and wonder. I sat in a carriage more luxurious than anything I had ever imagined, with velvet seats the color of deep wine and windows of actual glass that offered a clear view of the passing countryside. The seats were soft, the motion smooth, and there were blankets provided against the autumn chill. I felt like I had stepped into another world, a world where comfort was expected rather than hoped for. Nathaniel sat beside me, his hand occasionally finding mine, as though to reassure himself that I was real, that he was truly free, that the nightmare was finally over. He was still weak, still bearing the marks of his ordeal, but there was a light in his eyes that had not been there before, a joy that seemed to radiate from within. We talked as the miles passed, though our conversations were softer now, more intimate. He told me more about his life, about the responsibilities that awaited him, about the challenges he would face in bringing those who had conspired against him to justice. He spoke of reform, of his vision for a kingdom where all people, regardless of birth, would have the opportunity to flourish. And he spoke of me, of how I had given him reason to hope, to fight, to believe that goodness still existed in a world that had given him so much reason to doubt it. I listened, and I wondered, and I dared not hope for too much. I was still a servant girl, regardless of what I had done. The chasm between us had not closed simply because I had saved his life. The world would not suddenly accept a woman of my station as anything more than a curiosity, a brief, bright moment in the life of a great man before he moved on to greater things. But Nathaniel seemed to sense my doubts, and he addressed them directly as the carriage rolled through the countryside toward the glittering spires of the capital. "I know what you are thinking," he said. "I can see it in your eyes, the way you hold yourself apart, as though you expect at any moment to be told that none of this is real. But I want you to understand something, Vivian. I want you to understand that what happened in that stone building was not an illusion, not a dream born of desperation. What I feel for you is real, and I have no intention of letting you go." I told him that he was a duke, that he was meant for someone of his own station, that the world would never accept me as anything more than a passing fancy. But even as I spoke the words, I felt their hollowness, felt the way they rang false against the truth of what was between us. He took my face in his hands, his touch gentle but insistent, and he looked at me with those gray eyes that had seen past every barrier I had ever built. "The world," he said, "can go hang. I have spent my entire life doing what the world expected of me, being what the world demanded I be. And where did it get me? Chained in a forgotten building, waiting to die. You are the only person who has ever seen me, Vivian. The only person who has ever loved me for who I am, not what I represent. And I will not give that up, not for any crown, not for any kingdom." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that love could triumph over circumstance, that the chains of society could be broken as surely as the iron chains that had bound him in that stone room. But I had lived too long in the shadow of great estates, had seen too many hopes dashed against the rocks of reality. I told him that I loved him, because it was true, and because I could not bear to keep it hidden any longer. But I also told him that I was afraid. He kissed me then, softly, tenderly, a promise and a seal all at once. "I know you are afraid," he said. "I am afraid too. But we will face that fear together. And we will win, Vivian. I promise you, we will win." When we reached the capital, I was taken to a townhouse that belonged to the Duke and given rooms more opulent than any I had ever seen. The walls were papered in silk, the floors covered in carpets so thick that my feet sank into them with every step. A lady's maid was assigned to attend me, a young woman named Clara who seemed both baffled and amused by my obvious discomfort with luxury. Clara was perhaps a year or two older than I, with auburn hair and freckles scattered across her nose, and she possessed a practical good humor that put me immediately at ease. She helped me bathe, the first proper bath I had taken in years, in a copper tub filled with water that had been heated over the fire and scented with lavender and rose petals. She washed my hair and combed it until it gleamed, and then she dressed me in clothes that felt like clouds against my skin. Soft linen and fine wool in colors I had only ever seen on the ladies I had served. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman who stared back at me. She was beautiful, this woman, with dark hair and dark eyes and skin that glowed in the candlelight. She looked like someone who belonged in this world of silk and silver, someone who had been born to privilege rather than thrust into it by circumstance, and I felt a sudden pang of something like grief for the simple servant I had been, for the life I had left behind, for the identity I was being asked to shed. That evening, Nathaniel came to see me. He had been bathed and fed and dressed in clothes befitting his station, a dark coat of impeccable cut, a white cravat tied in an elegant knot, breeches and boots that gleamed with polish. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the gaunt prisoner in chains, and in his place stood a man of undeniable presence and power, tall and broad-shouldered, with those gray eyes now bright with vitality and purpose. But when he looked at me, his expression softened into the same tenderness I had seen in that dark stone room. He crossed the room to where I stood and took my hands in his, and for a long moment, we simply looked at each other, marveling at the journey that had brought us here. "You are beautiful," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. "But you were always beautiful, Vivian. The clothes change nothing. They only reveal what was always there." He told me that Lord Blackwood and Lord Ravenswood had been arrested and would stand trial for treason. Their conspiracy had been broader than even he had suspected, involving a network of disaffected nobles who hoped to use his disappearance to destabilize the succession and seize power for themselves. The evidence against them was overwhelming, gathered from documents found in Blackwood's study and testimony from servants who had witnessed more than their masters realized. Their fates were sealed, Nathaniel said, and there was satisfaction in his voice, a grim pleasure in seeing justice done. But that was not why he had come to see me. He had come to tell me that the king himself wished to meet me, to thank me personally for my role in saving the life of his heir. I stared at him in disbelief, certain that I had misheard. The king? Wishing to meet me? It was absurd, Impossible. A jest that I could not quite understand. He assured me that it was no jest. His Majesty has been informed of everything, he said. He knows what you did, the risks you took, the courage you displayed. He wishes to express his gratitude in person. Tomorrow morning, you will be presented at court, and I will be there beside you to ensure that you are treated with all the respect you deserve. I could not sleep that night. I lay in the enormous bed, surrounded by silken down, and I stared at the ceiling with wide eyes and a racing heart. I, Vivian Caldwell, a servant girl from a forgotten village, was to be presented at court. I was to meet the king. I was to stand in halls that I had never imagined entering, to be seen by people who would normally look right through me as though I did not exist. I thought of my mother, of the promise I had made to her as she lay dying. Choose kindness, she had said, even when it costs you, even when it seems foolish. I had chosen kindness when I entered that stone building. I had chosen kindness when I offered an apple to a stranger. And now that choice had led me here, to a future I could never have imagined, to a man I could never have hoped to meet. Was this what she had meant? Was this the destiny she had seen for me, hidden in her words, like a seed waiting for the right moment to bloom? The morning came too quickly, and Clara arrived to help me dress in a gown of deep blue silk that had apparently been ordered specifically for this occasion. It was more elaborate than anything I had ever worn, with a bodice fitted to my figure and skirts that fell in elegant folds to the floor. My hair was arranged in an elaborate style, pinned and curled and decorated with tiny pearls that caught the light when I moved. A simple strand of larger pearls was clasped around my neck, a gift from Nathaniel, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who might have been born to this life, who wore her finery with an ease that surprised me. But inside, my stomach churned with anxiety, and my hands trembled as I smoothed the folds of my skirt. I was an imposter, I thought, a servant girl playing at being a lady. And sooner or later, someone would see through the disguise and expose me for what I really was. Nathaniel met me at the bottom of the grand staircase, and the way he looked at me made the world stand still. He was dressed in formal court attire, dark coat and white cravat, his bearing now fully that of the Duke he was. But his smile was the same, warm and genuine and reserved for me alone. And in that smile I found the courage to face whatever lay ahead. He offered me his arm, and I took it, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath my gloved fingers. Together, we walked out to the waiting carriage that would take us to the royal palace. The palace was a place of such overwhelming grandeur that I struggled to take it all in. Columns of white marble stretched toward gilded ceilings, painted with scenes of angels and clouds. Paintings the size of walls depicted battles and coronations from centuries past, their colors still vivid despite the passage of time. Crystal chandeliers hung from every ceiling, catching the light from hundreds of candles and scattering it in rainbow prisms across the polished floors. Courtiers in silks and velvets filled the halls, their laughter and conversation creating a constant hum of sound that seemed to press against me from all sides. The women wore gowns in every color of the rainbow, their hair piled high and decorated with jewels that sparkled like stars. The men wore coats of embroidered velvet, their cravats tied in complicated knots, their manner casual and confident in a way that spoke of generations of privilege. I felt their eyes upon me as we walked, felt their curiosity, and, in some cases, their disdain. Who was this unknown woman on the arm of the Duke of Hartwell? Where had she come from, and what had she done to deserve such a position? I heard whispers follow in our wake, caught snippets of speculation and gossip, but I held my head high and kept my eyes fixed ahead, drawing strength from the warmth of Nathaniel's arm beneath my fingers. We were led through a series of increasingly ornate chambers until we reached a set of doors that dwarfed all the others. They were carved from oak and inlaid with gold, depicting scenes from the kingdom's history in intricate relief. 2 guards in ceremonial uniforms stood at attention, their faces impassive, and at a signal from Edmund Holloway, who had accompanied us, they pulled the doors open to reveal the throne room beyond. It was a hall of breathtaking beauty, larger than any room I had ever seen, with a ceiling so high that it seemed to touch the heavens. Windows of colored glass lined the walls, casting rainbows across the polished marble floor, and at the far end, upon a dais covered in crimson velvet, sat the throne itself. It was carved from oak and gold, its back rising in an elaborate pattern of leaves and crowns, and upon it sat King Edward, the ruler of our nation. He was an elderly man, perhaps 70 years of age, with hair that had gone entirely white and a face weathered by decades of responsibility. But his eyes were sharp and clear, sparkling with intelligence and humor, and when they found me in the crowd of courtiers, they held neither condescension nor judgment. They held only curiosity and something that might have been respect. The room was filled with nobles and dignitaries, all watching as we made our way down the central aisle. I felt the weight of every gaze, the pressure of every expectation, but I did not falter. I thought of my mother. I thought of the prisoner in chains. I thought of the apple, golden and perfect, resting in my palm. I had faced worse than this. I had walked into a prison and offered food to a stranger. I had risked my life to save a man I barely knew. This was merely a room full of people, and I would not let them see me tremble. We stopped before the throne, and Nathaniel released my arm and stepped forward. He knelt before the king, his head bowed in reverence, and spoke in a voice that carried throughout the chamber, clear and strong and filled with emotion. "Your Majesty," he said, "I present to you Miss Vivian Caldwell, the woman who saved my life." The king rose from his throne, and the room fell utterly silent. Even the whispers ceased, and the only sound was the soft rustle of silk as courtiers shifted to get a better view. He descended the steps of the dais with careful dignity, his robes of state flowing behind him, and I realized with a start that he was coming toward me. Toward me. A servant girl from a village that did not appear on most maps. I remembered too late that I should curtsy. I dipped into the gesture as gracefully as I could manage, my heart hammering against my ribs, and waited with bowed head for whatever would happen next. What happened next was something I never could have predicted. The king extended his hand, took mine in his, and raised me gently to my feet. His hand was warm and dry, the grip of a man accustomed to power but not corrupted by it. And then, to the audible gasp of the assembled court, he bowed his head to me. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice warm despite its formality, "the crown of this kingdom owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. You showed kindness to a stranger when kindness could have cost you everything. You risked your life to send word of his imprisonment when silence would have been the safer choice. And in doing so, you preserved the life of a man who is not merely my heir, but the hope of this nation's future." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I was drowning in the impossibility of the moment, in the surreal experience of having a king bow to me, of being addressed as though I were someone of consequence. My throat was tight with emotion, and my eyes burned with tears I refused to let fall. The king continued, his gaze never leaving mine. "It is said that true nobility is not a matter of birth, but of character," he said. "And today I have seen the truth of that saying. You, Miss Caldwell, possess a nobility that many in this room, myself included, would do well to emulate. Your courage shames those who have more and do less. Your compassion illuminates the path that we, as a nation, should strive to follow." He turned to address the court, still holding my hand in his. "Let it be known," he proclaimed, his voice rising to fill every corner of that vast chamber, "that from this day forward, Miss Vivian Caldwell is to be regarded as a ward of the crown, with all the rights and privileges that status entails. She has earned this honor not through lineage, but through the courage of her heart, and any who treat her with less than the respect she deserves will answer to me personally." The court erupted in applause, though I could see that not all of it was sincere. There were those who smiled with genuine warmth, who seemed moved by the king's words and by my story. But there were others whose applause was perfunctory, whose eyes held calculation rather than kindness, and I knew that not everyone would accept this sudden elevation of a servant girl to the ranks of the privileged. I did not care. In that moment, with the king's hand warm around mine and Nathaniel's eyes shining with pride from where he stood beside the throne, I felt something I had not felt since my mother's death. I felt seen. I felt valued. I felt for the first time in years like I belonged somewhere, like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The days that followed were a whirlwind of new experiences and unfamiliar challenges. I was given permanent residence in Nathaniel's townhouse, with rooms of my own and servants to attend me. Clara remained as my lady's maid, and her practical good humor became an anchor in the storm of change that surrounded me. When I was overwhelmed by the intricacies of court protocol or confused by the customs of high society, she was there to guide me with patience and gentle teasing. I was fitted for an entirely new wardrobe, gowns and pelisses, and spencers in every color and style. The modiste who attended me was a Frenchwoman named Madame Delacroix, who clucked over my measurements and proclaimed that I had a figure that would be the envy of many a duchess. I was taught the intricacies of court etiquette by a stern elderly woman named Mrs. Pemberton, who drilled me on everything from the proper depth of a curtsy to the correct forms of address for various ranks of nobility. And I was introduced to what seemed like an endless parade of nobles and dignitaries who wished to meet the woman who had saved the Duke. Some were kind. Lady Isabel Thornton, a widow of perhaps 30 years whose husband had been a close friend of Nathaniel's father, took me under her wing and guided me through the treacherous waters of high society with patience and grace. She was beautiful in a subdued way, with soft brown hair and gentle eyes, and she possessed a warmth that was rare among the aristocracy. She taught me which forks to use at formal dinners, how to navigate the subtle hierarchies of the court, and which nobles could be trusted and which were vipers in silk clothing. Others were not so welcoming. Lady Marguerite Ashworth, a woman of perhaps 25 with cold blue eyes and a smile that never reached them, made no secret of her disdain for me. She was beautiful in the way that ice is beautiful, all sharp edges and glittering surfaces, and she had been considered a leading candidate for Nathaniel's hand. My sudden appearance in his life had threatened her ambitions, and she was determined to make me pay for it. She whispered poisonous words wherever she went, questioning my background, my motives, my very right to exist in spaces that had once belonged exclusively to people like her. I heard the rumors she spread, tales of impropriety and manipulation, suggestions that I had somehow bewitched Nathaniel or traded upon his vulnerability. They were lies, but they were effective lies, and there were many who believed them. I tried not to let her cruelty affect me, but there were nights when I lay awake and wondered if she was right. What was I doing here, in this world of silk and silver? I had no training for this life, no breeding, no family name to recommend me. I was an imposter wearing borrowed clothes, playing a role I had never auditioned for, and sooner or later, surely, someone would see through the disguise and expose me for what I really was. It was during one of these dark nights that Nathaniel came to me. I was sitting by the window in my chamber, looking out at the moonlit gardens below, watching shadows move across manicured lawns that I still could not believe I had the right to walk upon. I heard a knock at the door, and before I could respond, he entered, his expression one of concern. "Clara told me you did not eat tonight," he said, "and that you have been quiet all day. What troubles you, Vivienne?" I tried to dismiss his worry, to assure him that I was merely tired, but he saw through my pretenses as easily as he had seen through my servant's dress in that cold stone room. He crossed the chamber and sat beside me on the window seat, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, but not so close as to compromise propriety. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me honestly. I cannot bear to see you suffering in silence." So I told him. I told him about Lady Marguerite's whispers and the contemptuous looks I received from certain quarters of the court. I told him about my fears of inadequacy, my sense of being a fraud in a world I did not understand. I told him that I was grateful beyond measure for everything he and the king had done for me, but that I sometimes wondered if it would have been better for everyone if I had simply returned to my life as a servant and left the aristocracy to manage its own affairs. He listened without interrupting, his gray eyes never leaving my face. When I had finished, he was silent for a long moment, and I feared that I had disappointed him, that my confession of weakness had diminished me in his estimation. But when he spoke, his voice was gentle and firm at once. "Vivienne," he said, "do you know why I was not broken by those weeks in chains? Why I did not succumb to despair despite everything they did to me?" I shook my head, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "Because I held on to hope," he said. "Even in the darkest moments, even when I believed I would die in that place, I held on to the belief that goodness still existed somewhere in the world. And then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I had not known I was making. You brought me food and water, yes, but more than that, you brought me proof that kindness still existed. You reminded me why the world was worth fighting for." He reached out and took my hand, his touch sending warmth flooding through me. "The people who look down on you are afraid," he continued. "They are afraid because you represent something they cannot control, something they cannot buy or inherit. You represent the possibility that worth is not determined by birth, that a servant girl can possess more honor than a dozen earls. And that terrifies them, because if it is true, then their entire world is built on a lie." His words penetrated the armor of self-doubt I had constructed around my heart, finding the vulnerable places and filling them with light. I looked at him. This man who had been born to privilege, but who had chosen to see me as an equal, and I felt the love I had been trying to suppress surge upward like a wave. "I love you," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. "I love you, Nathaniel, and I know that I should not, that it is impossible, that you are meant for someone of your own station. But I cannot help what I feel, and I cannot pretend any longer that my heart does not belong to you entirely." For a moment, he simply stared at me, and I felt a cold terror grip my chest. I had ruined everything. I had spoken what should never have been spoken, had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, had taken the fragile beauty of what we had and shattered it with my foolish, impulsive confession. But then he smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Vivienne," he said, "do you not know? Have you not understood? I have loved you since the moment you knelt beside me in that wretched room and offered me an apple. I have loved you through every conversation we shared in the darkness, through every moment of our journey to the capital, through every day of watching you navigate a world that was never meant for you with more grace than any lady born to it. I have loved you, and I was only waiting for the right moment to tell you." He lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles, his eyes never leaving mine. "I do not care about station," he said. "I do not care about what society expects or what the court will say. You are the woman I want beside me, the woman I want to share my life with. And if you will have me, I will spend the rest of my days proving to you that you are exactly where you belong." I wept then, tears of joy streaming down my cheeks, and he gathered me into his arms and held me as though he would never let me go. We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's warmth. Two souls who had found each other against all odds, two hearts that beat as one. The announcement of our engagement sent shockwaves through the court. Lady Marguerite's fury was legendary, and the gossip that surrounded us reached fever pitch. There were those who predicted disaster, who insisted that the Duke was throwing away his future on a servant girl who would never be accepted by society. There were those who whispered about manipulation and seduction, who suggested that I had somehow bewitched Nathaniel into forgetting his duty to his bloodline and his position. But there were others who rallied to our side. Lady Isabel spoke out in our defense, reminding the court that love was a more solid foundation for marriage than any political alliance. The king himself gave his blessing, saying that he was pleased to see his heir choose a wife based on character rather than convenience. And Edmund Holloway, who had initially regarded me with suspicion, gradually warmed to my presence, admitting that he had never seen Nathaniel as happy as he was in my company. The wedding took place in the spring, when the gardens of the royal palace were in full bloom and the air was sweet with the scent of roses and honeysuckle. I walked down the aisle of the royal chapel in a gown of ivory silk, my mother's pearls around my neck alongside the strand Nathaniel had given me, feeling as though I were floating through a dream from which I never wanted to wake. Nathaniel waited for me at the altar, his gray eyes bright with love, his smile radiant with joy. And when he took my hand and spoke his vows, I knew that every moment of struggle and suffering had led to this point, to this man, to this life I could never have imagined. We said our vows before God and the assembled nobility, and when Nathaniel kissed me, the applause that erupted was genuine and thunderous. Even Lady Marguerite, seated in the back of the chapel with a face like a thundercloud, could not diminish the joy of that moment. The first years of our marriage were ones of bliss, tempered by the realities of our position. Nathaniel's duties as heir kept him busy, and I gradually found my own role as the Duchess of Hartwell. I oversaw the household, managed the estates, supported charitable causes, and learned to navigate the political intricacies of court life. It was not always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the whispers of those who still resented my elevation cut deeply. But Nathaniel was always there, reminding me of my worth, loving me with a constancy that never wavered. And then there was the king. Edward's health had been declining for some time, and it was no secret that he would not live much longer. He called Nathaniel and me to his chambers one evening in late autumn, his face pale and tired, but his eyes still sharp and clear. "I wanted to see you both before the end," he said, his voice thinner than I remembered. "I wanted to tell you how proud I am of the man you have become, Nathaniel, and how grateful I am that you found Vivienne. She has made you better, and she will make you a better king." Nathaniel started to protest, but the king silenced him with a raised hand. "Do not be modest," he said. "I have watched you both, and I have seen the change in you. You were always capable, always intelligent, but there was a coldness in you, a distance from the world that worried me. She has warmed that coldness. She has given you a heart to match your mind, and that is what this kingdom needs, what it has always needed, a ruler who can think and feel, who can govern with wisdom and lead with compassion." He turned to me, and I saw tears glistening in his old eyes. "And you, Vivienne," he said, "you have taught this court a lesson that will not soon be forgotten. You have shown them that compassion is not weakness, that humility is not shame, that true nobility comes not from blood, but from the choices we make when no one is watching. You will be a worthy queen. I know it as surely as I know anything." I knelt beside his bed and took his frail hand in mine. I thanked him for everything he had done for me, for the chances he had given me, for seeing potential in a servant girl when so many others would have seen nothing. He smiled and patted my hand, and when we left his chambers, I knew that I would not see him again. Edward died 3 weeks later, peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by those who loved him. The nation mourned its beloved king, and Nathaniel was crowned in a ceremony of solemn magnificence. I stood beside him as his queen, wearing a crown that felt both heavy and sacred upon my brow, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto my shoulders like a mantle I had been born to wear. We ruled together, Nathaniel and I, striving to be the kind of monarchs that Edward would have been proud of. We reformed the laws regarding servants' rights, ensuring that those who labored in the houses of the great would be treated with dignity and fairness. We established schools for the poor, believing that education was the key to unlocking potential that might otherwise be wasted. We opened the doors of the palace to artists and thinkers of all backgrounds, creating a court that valued merit as highly as lineage. And through it all, we loved. Through the challenges and triumphs, through the political storms and the quiet evenings, through sickness and health, we loved. Nathaniel remained the man I had met in that dark stone room, tender and strong and utterly devoted. And I remained the woman who had offered an apple to a stranger, still sometimes amazed at the turns my life had taken, but never for a moment doubting that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Years passed, and our love only deepened. We grew older together, watching the kingdom flourish under our guidance, watching the changes we had made take root and bear fruit. The servants who had once been invisible were now protected by law. The poor who had once been forgotten were now educated and empowered. The society that had once been rigidly divided by class was slowly, gradually beginning to change. I planted an orchard behind the palace, apple trees that reminded me of my mother and the cottage where I had grown up. I tended them myself, much to the confusion of the gardeners, finding peace in the simple work of pruning and watering and watching new life grow. And when the trees bore fruit, I sent apples to the servants' quarters, to the kitchens, to anyone who wanted them. A small gesture, perhaps, but one that carried meaning beyond its simplicity. I write these words now as an old woman, looking back on a life that was more than I ever dared to dream. Nathaniel sleeps beside me still, his hair silver now, but his eyes the same gray I fell in love with so many years ago. The apple trees in my orchard are in full bloom, their blossoms white against the spring sky, and when I look at them, I think of my mother, and I hope that she would be proud of the woman I became. They say that a single act of kindness can change the world. I know this to be true because I have lived it. A simple apple, offered without thought of reward, set in motion a chain of events that led me from a servant's cottage to a throne. But it was never really about the apple, was it? It was about the choice, the decision to see another human being suffering and to reach out, even when reaching out was dangerous, even when the safe path was to walk away. That is the lesson I have tried to teach through my life and my reign, that we are all capable of great things, not because of who we are born to be, but because of who we choose to become. That love knows no station, that courage requires no title, and that sometimes the most powerful people in the world are those who have nothing to offer but their hearts. I was a servant girl who gave an apple to a starving prisoner, and the next day a king bowed to me. But the true miracle was not the bow, nor the crown that followed. The true miracle was discovering that I had been worthy all along, that my value had never depended on the opinions of others, and that the love I had been searching for was waiting for me in the most unexpected place. If you are reading these words, wherever you are, whatever circumstances bind you, know this: your kindness matters, your compassion has power, and the small choices you make in the darkness, when no one is watching, have the potential to change not only your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. Be brave, be kind, and never, ever underestimate the extraordinary destiny that may be waiting for you, hidden in the most ordinary of moments. This is my story. This is my truth, and I would not change a single word of it